In the 13th century, one empire conquered more land than any other in human history, more than the Romans, more than Alexander the Great, and it began in the vast grasslands of Central Asia. They were the Mongols. But how did a relatively small group of nomadic horsemen conquer half the world? How did they defeat powerful kingdoms, massive empires, and armies that were far larger than their own? To understand this, we have to start on the steppe. The Central Asian steppe is a massive open landscape, thousands of kilometers of grasslands stretching across the continent. Winters here are brutal. Temperatures drop far below freezing. Summers can be scorching and dry. For centuries, the people who lived here survived by herding animals, moving constantly, and adapting to the harsh environment. Life on the steppe demanded endurance, speed, and resilience. And these qualities would eventually shape one of the most formidable armies in history. In the late 12th century, a young warrior named Temujin began uniting the scattered Mongol tribes. Temujin had grown up in hardship. His father was poisoned by rival tribes. His family was abandoned and forced to survive alone. But through determination, alliances, and warfare, Temujin slowly gained power. By the year 1206, he had united the Mongol tribes under a single banner. And at a great assembly of warriors, Temujin received a new title, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, and resilience. And these qualities would eventually shape one of the most formidable armies in history. But uniting the tribes was only the beginning. What made the Mongols truly unstoppable was the army they built. At the heart of that army were the horse archers. Every Mongol warrior learned to ride from early childhood. By the time they were adults, they could control a horse at full speed while firing arrows with deadly accuracy. A Mongol rider could shoot forward, to the side, and even backward while riding away from the enemy. Speed was their greatest weapon. Each warrior often traveled with several horses, allowing the army to move extraordinary distances without stopping. Entire Mongol armies could travel faster than most messengers. But speed alone was not their only advantage. The Mongols mastered one of the most deceptive tactics in warfare, the feigned retreat. They would attack an enemy force, then suddenly turn and flee. To their opponents, it looked like panic. Victory seemed close. The enemy army would begin chasing the retreating Mongols, but the retreat was a trap. As the pursuing army stretched out and lost formation, Mongol riders would suddenly turn back. Arrows would rain down from every direction. Within moments, the hunters became the hunted. This combination of speed, discipline, and deception made the Mongol army unlike anything the world had ever seen. But the Mongols did not rely on speed and skill alone. Their army was built on a remarkably strict system of organization. Genghis Khan divided his forces using a decimal structure. Units of 10 warriors formed a squad. 10 squads formed a company of 100. 10 companies formed a regiment of 1,000. And 10 regiments created a force of 10,000 warriors. This unit was known as a tumen. Each level had its own commander. Orders could travel quickly through the ranks. and every soldier knew exactly where he belonged. Discipline was absolute. If one warrior fled in battle, his entire unit could be punished. But loyalty worked both ways. Promotion was based on ability, not noble birth. A common herdsman could rise to become a commander if he proved himself in battle. The system created an army that was both flexible and extremely coordinated. Even across vast distances of the steppe, it was one of the most efficient military organizations the world had ever seen. The Mongol army was not only organized with precision, it was also built for speed. Almost every Mongol warrior fought on horseback. From an early age, Mongol children learned to ride, to hunt, and to shoot with a bow while moving. A skilled rider could control his horse with his knees, leaving both hands free to fire arrows. This made the Mongol cavalry incredibly mobile. A Mongol warrior often traveled with several horses. When one horse became tired, he would simply switch to another. This allowed Mongol armies to move extraordinary distances, sometimes over 100 kilometers in a single day. But speed was only part of their advantage. The Mongols also mastered battlefield tactics. Instead of charging directly into the enemy, they often attacked from a distance. Mounted archers would ride in wide circles around opposing armies, firing arrows again and again, harassing their enemies, breaking their formations, and exhausting them before the real attack began. But one of the most famous Mongol tactics was the false retreat. The Mongols would suddenly turn and appear to flee the battlefield. Many enemies believed the battle had already been won, so they rushed forward in pursuit. But the retreat was only a trick. Once the enemy formation had stretched and broken apart, the Mongols would suddenly turn back. Fresh cavalry units would appear from the flanks. Other units would attack from behind. Within moments, the enemy army could find itself completely surrounded. Confused, exhausted, and under attack from every direction. Speed, coordination, and deception. These tactics allowed the Mongols to defeat armies that were often far larger than their own. And across the vast open lands of Eurasia, few forces were able to withstand them. Once the Mongol army was unified and disciplined, its expansion began with astonishing speed. Their first major campaigns were directed toward northern China. At the time, China was divided between several powerful dynasties. Among them was the Jin dynasty, which controlled large cities, fortified walls, and massive armies. Yet even these defenses struggled against Mongol tactics. Instead of attacking cities blindly, the Mongols learned siege warfare. They captured engineers, studied foreign technologies, and adapted quickly. Soon they were building powerful siege machines, catapults, trebuchets, and massive siege towers. Cities that once believed themselves safe behind thick walls began to fall one by one. But China was only the beginning. Soon Mongol armies turned west, across deserts, across mountains, across thousands of kilometers of open land. Their next great target was the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast and wealthy empire stretching across Central Asia and Persia. At first, Genghis Khan attempted diplomacy. He sent merchants and envoys to open trade, but the ruler of Khwarezm made a fatal mistake. He arrested the merchants and executed the Mongol envoys. For Genghis Khan, this was an unforgivable insult. The response was swift and devastating. Mongol armies swept across the empire like a storm. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Others surrendered immediately, hoping to survive. Within only a few years, one of the most powerful empires in the region collapsed completely. The Mongol expansion did not stop there. Their armies continued moving west, toward the Middle East, toward Eastern Europe. And soon, much of Eurasia would feel the impact of the Mongol Empire. By the early 13th century, the Mongol Empire had already conquered vast regions of Asia. But their expansion did not stop there. Soon, their armies pushed even farther west. Their next targets lay in Europe. In 1237, a massive Mongol army led by Batu Khan crossed into the lands of the Rus. City after city fell before them. Rostov, Vladimir, Suzdal. Even the great city of Kiev was eventually captured and destroyed. From there, the Mongol armies continued their advance into Europe. In 1241, two major Mongol armies entered Central Europe. One force moved north into Poland. Another advanced south into the Kingdom of Hungary. In Poland, European knights gathered to stop the Mongol invasion. Among them were Polish forces, German knights, and warriors of the Teutonic Order. They met the Mongols near the town of Legnica. But the Mongols once again relied on speed, coordination, and deception. Using their familiar tactics of feigned retreat and encirclement, they shattered the European army. The Battle of Legnica ended in a devastating defeat for the defenders. Meanwhile, another Mongol army struck Hungary. At the Battle of Mohi, the Mongols launched a carefully planned attack. During the night, their forces crossed the Sajo River. Then, at dawn, they surrounded the Hungarian army. The result was catastrophic. The Hungarian forces were destroyed, and much of the kingdom was left open to invasion. For a moment, it seemed as though nothing in Europe could stop the Mongol advance. But then, something unexpected happened. In 1242, news arrived from the east. The great Khan had died. According to Mongol tradition, the princes of the empire had to return to choose a new ruler. And so, the Mongol armies withdrew from Europe. Had that message arrived later, the history of Europe might have been very different. After their victories in Eastern Europe, the Mongol armies seemed almost unstoppable. But their success was not based on numbers alone. In many battles, the Mongols actually fought with smaller armies than the forces they defeated. What made them so difficult to stop was the way they fought war itself. First, the Mongols relied heavily on intelligence. Long before their armies arrived, scouts were already moving through enemy territory. They studied roads, rivers, mountains, and cities. They learned how large the enemy armies were, where they were located, and how quickly they could move. This allowed Mongol commanders to plan their attacks with remarkable precision. Second, the Mongol armies were incredibly mobile. Because every warrior rode several horses, the army could travel enormous distances in a very short time. This allowed the Mongols to appear suddenly where their enemies least expected them. Cities and kingdoms often had very little warning before the Mongol armies arrived. Third, the Mongols used psychological warfare. Stories of destroyed cities spread fear across entire regions. Sometimes, an approaching Mongol army could cause a city to surrender before a single battle even began. And finally, the Mongol armies were disciplined. Their commanders communicated through signals, flags, and messengers. Even during chaotic battles, their units moved with remarkable coordination. Speed, planning, fear, and discipline. Together, these advantages made the Mongol war machine one of the most effective fighting forces in the history of the world. Had that message arrived later, the history of Europe
might have been very different.